Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
In recent weeks, protests have broken out in response to, and in some cases in defiance of, government orders related to COVID-19 and stay-at-home orders. Not surprisingly, Facebook is the platform many of these organizers have turned to in an effort to spread the word. With about 70% of U.S. adults active monthly on social media, and the vast majority of those users on Facebook-owned services, it is obvious why people turn to this platform. But should Facebook limit what it calls misinformation? According to a recent Wall Street Journal piece, Facebook is banning posts and groups promoting anti-lockdown protests that don't comply with government health directives, as organizers of those events seek to recruit new members on social media. That's what we'll be looking at today. Hopefully it's obvious why you care, with the vast majority of social media users on these Facebook-owned platforms, and 70% approximately of American adults using these services at least once a month. It has definitely become a major area in our society where information is spread, perhaps even the primary source. And when one of its largest players makes choices about what to take down and what to keep up, it concerns all of us. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on free speech and all things social media without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Who, just for the sake of transparency for today's episode, I am one of the 30% who do not use the Book of Face. So, as many of its, at least the people that I know, that's what I call it to them, because it is almost biblical in proportion to the power that it sways over the national public domain, the Book of Face.
But just in transparency, right, for our listeners, your household is not free of Facebook. Facebook is present in the household. You're just not a user.
We practice freedom of speech in this household.
Oh, okay.
So just because I don't use it doesn't mean that it's not allowed to be used.
Okay. Well, that's good. Get that little insight, right, from the Jackson house there. And that is where Lance is. For those that don't remember, Lance and I, unfortunately, are not in the same room currently, but probably smartly, we can see each other, and we've been managing, I think, pretty well, all things considered. But in this time, there's a lot of people that are getting aggravated and frustrated with having to stay at home or being told to stay at home. And that's led to some protest, especially in the places where these stay-at-home orders are the most severe. And that is what has prompted Facebook, which generally released guidance, Lance, when a lot of this started, that it would remove posts or information that were either contrary to health official advice or advocating that you not follow it, or specifically taking action, promoting action that was contrary to the advice of public health officials. And that is just to be clear, so that we're giving Facebook its due, that is the standard they are using. They pointed out that they do not specifically target anti-lockdown protests. They're targeting information that deals with defying government orders or government information. So just important to understand, I know it sounds like a semantic thing, and it is, but there are protests that are being organized that respect the government's orders while still protesting. You don't necessarily have to defy government orders, like one of the organizers who's quoted in this piece, Lance, points out that, he who was organizing the protest advised the people coming that they were not supposed to defy the government's orders. They needed to stay in their cars, respect social distancing. They weren't allowed to, or they weren't supposed to engage in behavior contrary to that. So some of his events they've been left up because they were respecting the rules that Facebook had said you have to follow. While other events that said, let's come out and all stand together in a huddle, those are being taken down. So just to be clear, so people understand, right, the line that Facebook is drawing.
Facebook is just following the law, because that's what the law, either in those municipalities or those states or in the federal government, depending on who has set the agenda for that given area of protest. So all Facebook has done, if you want to look at it on that level, is they are following the rules as the rules have been established.
They're making it harder for people to defy those rules by not allowing them to speak in contrast to those rules, or advocate.
Well, they can still have their protest. They can still violate the rule if they want. Facebook's just saying you can't use our platform to publicize it to gain more individuals to go with you.
Right.
If you want to get on the phone and call people, if you want to send up smoke signals from your backyard, if you want to send
out your eagle
and practice Morse code or whatever, or whatever form of information you want to use, you can. You're just not going to use Facebook to do it, because we're not going to let you use Facebook to violate the law.
Because I think that's true with the protest side. It's Facebook's being pretty clear. It's just, we're just not going to let you use our platform to spread falsehoods, or things that are contrary.
Right. To get the information out about your protest in which you're going to be violating the law.
Right.
So if you want to have your protest, Facebook's not stopping your protest. They're just saying if you want to get people to join you at your protest, you're going to have to use some other media or medium besides Facebook.
The question comes down to is, should Facebook have this type of guidance in place? And what I mean by that is the guidance that we are going to remove misinformation about COVID-19, which we classify as anything that's in direct contradiction to what public health officials are saying, or that is advocating that you not listen to public health officials. Those two seem to kind of be the cornerstones of this particular thing. Are we, you and I, are we pleased with this standard that Facebook has laid out, or do we see that as problematic?
Would you rather Facebook be promoting everybody to go up and hug each other and give each other high fives and not respect social distancing and telling everybody not to wear a mask and to walk into nursing homes and to other places where people are confined and to crowd into stores and bump into people?
What do you think?
Do you want them to promote that? Do you want them to promote those ideas? I don't. I don't want them to promote those ideas. I don't. If people have those ideas, are people allowed to have their own thoughts and their own ideas on this whole situation? They certainly are. But I don't necessarily want Facebook, nor do I want the news media of any sorts to be promoting those ideas. Now, I'm not saying that individuals can't have those ideas. I'm not saying that individuals don't have the right to protest on behalf of those ideas. But that doesn't mean that I think reputable or places that people think are reputable should be promoting those ideas as okay. Now, that's just the way, that's the way I feel. So, I don't have a problem with them doing this. I understand on one hand the whole freedom of speech thing, but Facebook's not stopping their organizing. Facebook's making it more difficult for them to get out organizers, which I guess is their argument as to why it might be a freedom of speech thing. But to me, I want Facebook. I want the New York Times. I even want Fox News to report what's true, not what's on somebody's social agenda for themselves. You want to talk about how this is hurting the economy? Talk about it. You want to talk about then how many lives we're going to risk if we do these things? Then let's talk about that. But I don't think you should actively be promoting behavior that we know is risky behavior. I would think, that's probably, wouldn't they be in trouble for doing that? That's where I am. Okay. And you can go ahead and now, say where I'm wrong in this, but that's the way I see this issue.
And I agree with you generally. Here's the thing. I don't disagree necessarily in principle with the idea that Facebook probably shouldn't allow. I mean, they're a private company. So this is what we're going to talk about in the next segment, this distinction of they are a private company. So when you talk about First Amendment rights, you get into this interesting area of, Lance or I don't have the right to take away your First Amendment rights. At the same time, we also don't have to let you stand on our property to say what you want to say. And Facebook's site and its different services are the property of Facebook. So from that standpoint, that's what we're going to look at next. I guess the point, Lance, is that Facebook's not consistent. And that's my problem with this is they pick and choose. Like we all heard about that big, rally in the desert to storm Area 51 that was on Facebook for a long time. And I think they finally took it down, but that was after public pressure. And they were recommending inciting violence against a military base. So
did they learn?
Well, maybe, and that's, I guess, what we're going to have to look at.
Maybe they learned from that. And so they responded a little quicker in this case.
So that's what we're going to look at coming up is some of the details here about how should we treat Facebook. They're in this interesting area. Are they a distributor? Are they a media company? Where do your First Amendment rights come in? Have we dealt with anything like this before? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
According to data pulled from several sources, about 70% of American adults use social media, and a vast majority of those are on Facebook products. That would include things like Facebook.com, Instagram, etc. Over 2/3 of users occupy Facebook specifically, while a third use Instagram and a fifth use WhatsApp, which is also owned by Facebook. With such dominance in the social media arena, some have questioned, especially in recent years, how unrestricted should social media be, and of course, specifically Facebook, but social media as a whole. One of the challenges, and this is what Lance and I kind of ended the last segment by talking about, is this idea that these are private entities, right? And what we mean by private is they are not government institutions. They are held by shareholders, and their large owners often are founders of the company. And much like Lance or I own a piece of property, right, or have a home, and Lance is not required to allow me to come over to his house and stand in his yard and yell profanities, Facebook is not required to allow you to come on their site and say whatever you want. They're allowed to put in place restrictions, and honestly, they're pretty much allowed. If Lance signed up and they just didn't feel like having Lance on their site, they're pretty much just allowed to remove him. It really isn't. And so when we talk about this idea of fair and right, I think it's important we talk about those things, but it's also critical to understand that in the case of Facebook, at least as it currently stands, there really aren't laws restricting much of that. Now, if Facebook got into a situation where they said, well, we're not going to allow any old white men on the platform. So Lance is out, we're not allowing people like Lance on the site, then you might get into a legal area. But if we just say, well, I just don't like Lance.
Would it be a legal area? I mean, there might be pressure on them. They might lose money. There might be people who protest them. But do they have the right to have that group if they're private?
Well, you get into discrimination based on sex, probably in that case, because we said male.
For a private company? If I take no government contracts or do no government business and it's my private club?
Yeah.
I can bow to social pressures. I mean, I might bow to social pressures. I might bow to economic pressures, but am I breaking the law?
So, you get into you can't necessarily refuse service to somebody on the basis of race. I'm not sure. I'm going to check on the age and gender component.
And I'm throwing that out there, and I'm not advocating for that. Make sure we don't have any first time listeners here and think, who is this guy that's spouting this kind of stuff? I don't believe in any of that, but I just wonder, am I breaking a law in that form?
The deal is, Lance, I got a quick answer. The law generally stipulates that a business owner can refuse service to anyone for any reason unless you are discriminating against a protected class. Now, some states have specific additions, okay, to protected class, but the national protected classes are as follows: race or color, national origin or citizenship status, religion or creed, sex, age, disability, pregnancy or genetic information, and veteran status. So it is illegal for you as a business to refuse somebody service on those grounds.
So every category that we could think of. So you're going to have to think outside the box and come up with a category that's not listed in there.
Well, like
to not give services to someone.
Yeah. The other thing is age, just to be clear, actually is really only people 40 and older. So you can discriminate and say, well, everybody under the age of 39 isn't allowed to use this service. But you can't say everybody age 40 and older isn't allowed to use this service.
Okay, now I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but just quickly, then why isn't AARP unconstitutional?
You mean because young people can't use it? Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Well, because it's legal to discriminate against people under the age of 40 based on their age. It's not legal to discriminate for people over the age of 40 or over.
But there are people over the age of 40 that aren't allowed to join AARP, right? Isn't it a 50 and older or 55 and older organization? I don't know. I'm not a member. I just get all their mailings.
That's an interesting.
So would somebody under that definition that you looked up,
right?
I know it's not your definition.
Yeah, the government.
But under the government's definition, then I'm just thinking out loud, folks. Don't write in.
Holes in there.
Don't call. Right. Don't come stand in my front yard and yell obscenities at me. I'm just asking a question. Then by that, just thinking off the top of my head, because we hadn't discussed this before the show started. Okay.
Yeah.
But
so that's the
back to our go ahead.
That's the Facebook portion, I think, that gets challenging. Is they're saying they're open to everybody, right? But there are rules that you have to follow to use the platform. So far that sounds pretty reasonable. I think.
Well, they say one thing in advertising, but then the rules of the company allow them to do something else.
Correct.
Because if I'm running a company that makes money off of selling advertising, I want the advertisers to know that everybody is available to be on this, because then it's easier for me to sell advertising and to promote making more money, right?
Yeah. Unless you're heavily.
But then when I set up the bylaws of my company, then I list certain things that you have to do to be a part of the service that I'm offering.
Right.
That's just typical. That's a typical business practice.
Yeah. I think the thing that comes into play is with Facebook's reach across its many divisions, and this is the question that we look at when we talk about, well, how should Facebook be treated? Because the easy thing to do, and I think what we've typically done in the past, with most social media, is defer to the standard way in which we refer to companies, which is they have the right to regulate their service themselves or not, as long as they're not violating, as long as they're not directly discriminating based on one of those things we talked about. The challenge, I think, that comes into play here is, well, we know the government has taken steps in the past to curtail or more heavily regulate industries which were, abusing the system. And there's lots of industries that do, okay? It's definitely not perfect. And even industries that are regulated still often find ways to abuse it, but sometimes less so. Utilities come to mind, I think, when you're looking at historical examples, because there didn't used to really be any price monitoring. You either paid what the utility asked or you didn't get service. And now the way that's changed is the government regulates how much a utility can charge for a service, because they didn't want utilities to be able to intentionally, gouge people on price. whether or not you...
Well, they broke up the monopolies so that there had to be competition.
Right.
Which then the idea being if there's competition, then you get it for a lower price because they can't gouge you, because if there's competition, true competition, somebody can come in and undersell them.
Right.
And you would go do business with them. So therefore, you're getting the lowest price available because the government stepped in and allowed competition to take place.
Exactly. So, I think that's a relatively easy example for people to understand. We kind of take it for granted today because that's pretty much how most of us have always lived is, you might pay a little bit different rate, in one part of the country than another for electric prices. But if Lance and I are using the same service provider, Lance doesn't pay a different fee than I do for my service. I can't.
Which wasn't always the case.
No. There used to be the
railroads, right. People were allowed to charge you different rates based on what you did and who you were. And
or if you were black.
What kind of deal you could negotiate exactly. And we've tried to take that out and make it more a level playing field for everyone.
Right. So that's where I think it comes down to that ultimate question of how do you treat social media these days? Because they like to claim this idea, Lance, and we talked about this before the show, that they are merely distributors of information, right? In other words, they're not responsible per se for what they distribute. They're merely disseminating the information, but they are not the ones that create it. And therefore they're not the ones that they're not using editorial privilege over it. The problem is, as hopefully people have learned from what we've talked about so far, Facebook is operating in this interesting kind of gray in-between area, right? They're not like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. They're not writing lots of articles and putting out content, but they are exercising selective editorial privilege over content. And the biggest example, obviously, right now is this COVID-19, what they classify as misinformation. In contrast to, they won't take down something put out by an elected official that is blatantly incorrect about something other than COVID-19, So I could be the elected council person of a town and say, the president killed 10 people, and they're not going to take that down. But they will take down if I say the doctors who are talking about COVID-19 are lying.
Well, and we've talked about this before. We're in an interesting time when it deals with social media. It is so new and it is so different than anything else that we've ever had that we don't really have any laws that fit it. It's one reason that the owner, Mark Zuckerberg, went to Congress, and we found out when we listened to the Congress people's questions, they didn't necessarily understand how this whole thing worked. And so we're trying to find where this new entity fits into the Constitution and the rules and what rules it should abide by. And I think this is just, as you point out, this is a major gray area that is being put out there now that we as the people, since we actually control the government, need to decide what do we want to do with things like Facebook and Instagram.
And that's
and just quickly, I just found it interesting in the article. It said all those people who quit Facebook and said, well, I got rid of Facebook, I went to Instagram. It's the same company, right? I mean, they don't even know. It's like, man, I get mad at Disney, and then they don't even know that one of the 7 channels that they watch is a Disney subsidiary.
Right. Yeah. So, well, Bradley, he's a member of that generation that thinks Facebook is gross, but he loves Instagram. So he's still in the Facebook clutches, even if you're not totally aware of Facebook's
knowingly or unknowingly, he still
grasp on you. Correct. Yes. So we're going to look at next the very question Lance just brought up there. Should we create new regulations? And if so, what would those regulations look like? How could we possibly regulate it in a fair and free way? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
With social media dominating the lives of many Americans, screen use of an average of 4 hours or more, we definitely spend a lot of time on our devices and in front of social media, and inevitably, more of us continue to get information from there. In fact, I think it was just a few weeks ago when we talked to our producer, Bradley, who's getting quite a lot of mentions in today's episode, without having the opportunity to speak in return. That's how we like it, right? We talked with Bradley about this, his sources of news, right? He sees information come through on Twitter. That's the frequent way that he learns about stuff happening. So, right. Sorry. Bradley wants me to be sure to put in before he worked here. He has changed that habit as a result, which is great. But a lot of people, right, that is how they get their news. And it's not just young people. I'm amazed, Lance, at how many people your age, right, spend their whole day on Facebook, consuming and sharing information. It's a big thing amongst all age groups now. And
yeah, they woke up and they post
right.
it, and they take a picture of their breakfast and they post it, and then they say they're going out to walk the dog and they post it, and oh yeah, it goes on, and we're watching this movie on TV and they post it, and yeah, all day long they let everybody know exactly where they are and what they're doing.
I hope people can sense Lance's disdain for the idea of sharing so much with so many. But
hey, it's a free country. I mean, if you want everybody to know your business and when you're away from your house and when you're away from your
right,
property,
you're just not one of those people that wants to share that.
I just don't understand why you would want to do that. Right.
The question that this all brings us to is what we talked about a little in the last segment, is how should we treat Facebook? And unfortunately, Lance and I didn't really arrive at a conclusion there, because I think the bigger question is, well, what do we want to do about it, right? It's pretty obvious to anybody that takes a few minutes to look that Facebook's standard is it's not uniform, right? There's a lot of unevenness to it when they apply taking down misinformation, because it's not consistent. Now, granted, I will say this, in recent months and over the last year, they've gotten more aggressive about if they find news articles that are being passed off as totally factual when in reality they are not, they will sometimes, if it's been flagged, take it down. But even that isn't 100%, consistent, and they won't do it if it's a public figure. They won't take down misinformation from public figures, or at least that's been on like a case-by-case, very rare basis. So I think that the concern that Lance and I have, and that hopefully some of the others have, is across these platforms, should there be some kind of consistent measure, or perhaps something that requires a consistent measure? In other words, you don't have to tell Facebook what it has to take down, but you do tell it that if you're going to put in place a restriction like misinformation, it has to evenly be applied to everyone. In other words, you're not allowed to pick and choose the segments of your user base on which you're going to apply specific policy to. So what do you think, Lance? Do you want there to be any regulations created for social media? We're not going to hone it into just Facebook. And if so, what do they look like in your mind?
It's just a very difficult question, because what I think most people can't do, they can very quickly tell you what they should do, but they don't then understand what the flip side of that is and how it can be used to work against them. And that's the only problem that I see is when you make a set of rules, all you do is set people off to finding ways to break that rules or to get around that rule. And we don't stop and think as an American people, okay, we're going to put this rule into place, but we don't realize how that rule could then in turn hurt us in a different way. For example, we talked about it before, for example, the Patriot Act, right? I mean, we're going to be safe getting on airplanes. And then all of a sudden it takes us how many hours to get through a crowded airport? Not now, but I mean, when we were doing it, well, but this is what we have. This is the price we pay for being, quote, air quotes, safe on an airplane. So we make these rules and we sometimes don't realize what's going to happen because of that. And if we did that, if we made rules and understood then what could happen, then, and we were okay with the rule, then I guess that's okay. But I'm really hard with having rules like that. I want to be able to decide what I want to believe and not believe. So now you have social media and it's like, wow, they could print anything and everything because it's all out there. All you have to do is just click it in and you can find whatever topic you want. So do you truly believe that there should be no censorship? Then social media is the place for you to go because they have the capabilities with all of the cloud space and everything else to hold all these different ideas and stories out there. And then you get to go find them and you get to decide for yourself what to believe or not believe. So I guess we're open, and I'm listening to your argument now coming back at me. So it should be totally open, no rules. That way it's the closest thing we have to zero censorship, either legal or illegal censorship.
As you were sharing the thoughts there, I was just thinking about, I was going to lead off by saying, I want to be really honest with people. And that might suggest to some that I'm not always that way. I hope I try to be that way. And I think Lance does too. And I think that speaks to, usually we save this till the end, but it just seems like the perfect opportunity. What's our mission, Lance, that you and I are always working so hard to accomplish and that all of us at True Chat, including our producer, Bradley, is striving to uphold?
Well, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. We've never claimed, and notice nowhere in there does it say we have all the answers. We're just having a conversation about an issue that is on people's minds, that's in the news. And hopefully by having this discussion, we can come up with maybe some kind of answer or some kind of solution, but we don't have them necessarily. We have ideas, but we're open. And we want you to be a part of the discussion so that we can all come to some kind of the same conclusion or the same set of standards by which we can live in this world.
I struggle with this because I think people who have listened to the show know that Lance and I are fierce defenders of the press and making sure that access to information is available, and are always, try to be anyway, really careful about any time we're talking about limiting people's access to information and their ability to share it. That said, over the past probably 2 years, I have become convinced that something is necessary in the realm of social media because, and here's why, and I know this will sound a little conspiracy theorist, but the problem when you give any private institution, or public one for that matter, any private institution, the ability to control about 1/6 of the world's population, the information that's available to 1/6 of the world's population, that concerns me. And having it completely unregulated or mostly unregulated the way it is right now, I don't like. And Lance knows, him and I are both of this mindset that we especially don't like when the federal government gets involved in this stuff typically, but that we're in a situation, I think, with companies like this where we really have to ask ourselves, to become such a part of our lives, can we really afford to continue down the road of let them move fast and break things? Is that really what we're okay with when it comes to the very information that informs our decisions about who we vote for and who we put in office? And for me, no. Do I worry about it for Lance and myself? No, because Lance and I read what we consider to be reputable sources. We often are bringing in information from multiple sources, but there's so much misinformation out there. I think we're suffering, Lance, from too much information, and a lot of it's wrong as opposed to too little. So my gut is we need to lean a little more toward curbing some of the, blatant falsehoods, and a little less toward the protection of, put whatever you want, whenever you want, to whoever you want out mentality, just because I think the pendulum has swung pretty far that way. And I think it's time for it to swing back a little. So specifically, and I'll let you react to this quickly because we've only got a few seconds left. The idea of you start with a pretty simple one, which is just if a social media company is going to apply a policy to its user base, right? If it's going to say this is a prerequisite for using our service, then it has to apply to the user base universally. In other words, I can't say, well, it only applies to Lance. I've made up this rule and only Lance has to follow it, but nobody else has to follow it. And the other thing is, and Lance and I talked about this before, creating a very small, but a research group inside the government devoted to specifically nonpartisan. Republicans and Democrats can equally appoint the people or hire the people or however, that is specifically responsible for researching social media and presenting policy options, a small range of policy options, because as Lance pointed out, what's become so clear is our lawmakers don't know jack about this. And they're not likely to figure it out on their own. And frankly, they got a lot of other things to think about. So they don't need to be experts on it. They need experts to come up with some simple conclusions that Americans and lawmakers have access to. And then our elected officials need to decide, here's what we want to do. Those are the two things, Lance.
Well, we're about out of time, and I'm just going to say this. I have a real hard time when you mention the government's going to come in and regulate it, and we're going to get a small group within the government. Because then that allows it to act so independently and so far removed from any kind of control mechanism that bothers me. We've done that in the name of some other things that we don't have time to discuss, but I think we've really brought up some interesting issues and some interesting ideas for people to think about. And I think we're going to have to revisit this again. But I will just say, I know on the surface what you said doesn't sound bad, but my mind's just racing on all the ways that those two little, quote, little things could be abused by the government. And that always causes me a reason to pull back just a little bit. But it's a good starting point, for another discussion on another day. And, hopefully we've raised some questions that'll help people, come to some kind of conclusion on this for themselves. And we can start to reach some kind of consensus about what to do with this social media giant that's being created. We
have to keep asking the questions. That much is for sure. Hopefully we've helped you all realize this is an important topic, one that certainly deserves more attention, hopefully by our elected leaders. And at the very least, if we all spend time talking about it, if we make sure they know that we care about it, we're likely to see a national dialogue on it continue. And that's what counts. So Lance, and keeping with that idea, we need people to bring others into the fold, right? To encourage them to tune into the State of Us and get informed and share their thoughts with us. So what are some of the ways that our existing listeners could invite new listeners to tune in to the podcast version of this program?
Well, if you listen to podcasts or listen to us through the podcast on Tuesdays and Thursdays when we release new shows, you can get us through Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
And if you're one of our many syndicated radio listeners, obviously invite people to tune in on the same station that you're on as well. We appreciate it, however people choose to access us. And you can find all that information at thestateofus.org, links, articles, books, and more. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for making this program possible. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.